Imagine looking out across a landscape so vast, so monotonous, so utterly draining that it breaks the oldest, deepest instinct coded into your very DNA. We're talking about the fundamental human imperative: to walk, to move, to never stay put. Look back at our story, the story of Jesus. We are not settlers, we are escape artists. Our entire success as a species is predicated on movement. We didn't conquer the world by being strong. We conquered it by being the ultimate restless vagabonds. We walked out of Africa, not once, but several times. We spread across continents faster than any other large mammal in history. We flowed into the Arabian Peninsula, hugged the coast of India, exploded into Southeast Asia, and island hopped to Australia. By 65,000 years ago, we were already lighting fires on a continent no other hominin had ever touched. Movement is our default setting. It is the hum beneath the surface of all our history. We see a barrier and we think, how do we get around it? We see a mountain and we think, where is the pass? We are inherently, constitutionally incapable of sitting still. And yet, for an agonizing, protracted, almost unbelievable span of time, a dark age of stagnation that we rarely talk about, we stopped. We were caught. This is the story of the invisible prison. The moment humanity found the ultimate bottleneck, the place where all that restless ambition died, and our species was forced into a profound, terrifying, existential pause right at the center of the world. We tend to think of human migration as a smooth, unstoppable tide. Africa to the Middle East, then bam, everything else. But history isn't clean. History is cruel, full of friction, and profoundly inconvenient. And the ultimate inconvenience happened right where the modern world began, in the desolate, wind-scoured heart of Central Asia. We are talking about the gateway to Siberia, the Altai region, the steppes stretching toward Beringia. This was the final frontier, the last massive landmass we had yet to settle, the key to the entire new world. Our ancestors had already mastered the tropics and the deserts. They had fought lions and survived volcanic eruptions. They stood at the doorway to the Americas, an entire, untouched continent of opportunity, and they simply stopped. Archaeological evidence is stark and relentless on this point. Sometime between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, a critical chunk of the human population that was destined to colonize the rest of the globe found themselves in a terrifying stasis. Their migratory momentum died. They were geographically positioned for a final push, but they were biologically and socially paralyzed. Think about that timeline. 30,000 years. That is an enormous amount of time for a species defined by its speed. In the 30,000 years since this pause ended, we have invented agriculture, built pyramids, sailed around the globe, triggered industrial revolutions, and walked on the moon. Yet during this period in Central Asia, the overriding human action was waiting. So, what was the barrier? Why the pause? If you were to ask someone today, they'd point to the obvious: the ice, the cold. We call it the last glacial maximum, LGM. Massive ice sheets, crushing temperatures, landscapes turned into frozen deserts. And yes, the climate was horrific, but that cannot be the whole answer. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the easy answers often miss the central truth. If it was simply the cold, we wouldn't have had the pause we did. We were ingenious. We had fire, tailored clothing, and complex hunting strategies. Our cousins, the Neanderthals, had survived bitter European freezes for hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, we know that Homo sapiens were already penetrating the harsh environments of Siberia and the Eurasian steppe well before the LGM truly peaked. Sites like Yana, deep in the Arctic Circle, show us that we had the capability to survive the extreme cold as far back as 32,000 years ago. The problem then was not merely survival. The problem was mobility. To understand the prison, you have to imagine the landscape as a gigantic, living ecosystem that only offered one thing: the mammoth steppe. This wasn't a dense forest. It was a wide-open grassland stretching for thousands of miles, populated by megafauna: mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant bison. A hunter's paradise, right? Wrong. The mammoth steppe was an environment of extreme feast or crushing famine. The megafauna were there, but they were dangerous, unpredictable, and required intense social coordination to hunt. And crucially, the resources required to sustain mobility: wood for sleds, fuel for constant fire, large herds of easy-to-track prey, were geographically inconsistent. Imagine yourself standing on that endless plain. The wind is a physical presence, tearing at your skin and stealing your breath. The temperatures routinely drop below -40. Every scrap of fuel, every calorie, every minute of life is purchased at a terrifying cost. You look north and you see nothing but more of the same, stretching into eternity. You look east towards the Great Bridge to the New World and you see the same. The human imperative to walk wasn't stopped by a mountain range. It wasn't stopped by a massive sea. It was stopped by a perfect confluence of ecological scarcity and climatic brutality that created the ultimate logistical nightmare. If you are a highly mobile hunter-gatherer group, your survival strategy is simple. If things get tough here, you walk 500 miles and they will be better there. But in Central Asia, during this era, walking 500 miles only guaranteed one thing: you would die 500 miles away from your previous location without having found any new resources. The invisible prison wasn't built of stone. It was built of energy balance. Our ancestors were locked in a constant, desperate calculation. Is the caloric gain from moving worth the inevitable loss of energy to the environment? For thousands of years, the answer was a simple, terrifying no. They were stuck. They congregated in the few regions that offered reliable water, shelter, and predictable hunting routes, like the river valleys and caves of the Altai Mountains. The density of archaeological sites in certain regions during this period tells a harrowing story. Our ancestors were clustering. They were forced to stay close, overlapping territories, sharing the same hunting grounds, watching the same resources dwindle generation after generation, while the instinct to walk, to escape, to conquer the rest of the world was crushed beneath the weight of unrelenting ice and desperate hunger. And when you take the defining characteristic of a species, its mobility, its freedom, and you lock it down for 30 millennia, something breaks. Something has to give. The pressure builds not just environmentally, but socially, psychologically. They were trapped together, and that forced proximity, that crushing scarcity, gave rise to a whole new kind of human suffering, a struggle not against the mammoth or the wind, but against each other. Because when you cannot run, and when resources become finite, the greatest danger in the invisible prison is always going to be the people locked inside with you. And the price paid for that long, agonizing pause was violence. Let's be brutally honest about what scarcity does to us. We romanticize the Paleolithic hunter, the nomadic pioneer, but when resources become finite and the escape routes vanish, the romance dies. It is replaced by a cold, immediate calculation: my children eat or yours do. When we talk about the invisible prison of Central Asia, that vast frigid land where our ancestors were stuck between 50,000 and 15,000 years ago, we are talking about a geographical choke point designed by the very movement of the planet. We were cornered. Look at the map of the last glacial maximum. To the north, the massive Scandinavian and Siberian ice sheets were grinding the continent flat, utterly uninhabitable. To the west, the ice essentially merged with the Atlantic cold, locking down access to Europe for long, terrifying stretches. But the real walls, the ones that enforced the prison's cruel boundaries, were to the south and east. The Himalayas and the massive Tibetan plateau were rising, creating an impenetrable icy fortress, a wall of rock and altitude that funneled all usable moisture out of the northern steppes. South of this wall, lush tropics, vibrant ecosystems, easy walking. But crossing that wall was a death sentence. We were squeezed into a crescent of land, the Mammoth Steppe, which stretched from modern-day Ukraine across Siberia. This was a place defined by cold and wind, but sustained by the massive biomass of megafauna: mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, bison. It was enough to live, but never enough to expand. Imagine you're living in this corridor. Every 20 years, you look north. Still ice. You look west. The glaciers haven't budged. You look south. Mountains that scrape the sky, impossible to cross. The instinct that defines humanity, the desire to see what's over the next hill, is crushed. You are living in a psychological pressure cooker, and the archaeological evidence doesn't lie about this forced density. We find sites like Kostenki in Russia or Malta Buret deep in Siberia. These aren't just temporary camps. These are semi-permanent villages, colossal achievements in engineering, huts built not of timber, which was scarce, but of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of colossal mammoth bones. Think about the sheer, grueling effort required to hunt and stockpile those materials, and the number of people required to maintain these settlements year-round for generations. Why build houses out of the bones of giants if you planned on leaving next spring? Because they knew they couldn't. These sites show overlapping occupation layers spanning thousands of years. We see populations rooted to the spot, clinging to the few reliable water sources and the familiar migration paths of the remaining herds. They didn't just share a vast territory, they were sharing the same small, reliable patches within that territory. Their territories were shrinking, but their population numbers, driven by the basic biological imperative to reproduce, were stable, perhaps even slightly growing in good seasons. This is the point where the invisible prison becomes most insidious. The moment the population density exceeds the ability of the immediate environment to support it without conflict. Academics who study Paleolithic violence often point out a fundamental shift here. When early humans had room to run, they used avoidance as their primary conflict strategy. If you had a fight with a neighboring group over a watering hole, you packed up and walked 100 miles in the opposite direction. You absorbed the loss of that spot, knowing there was an infinite frontier waiting for you. But what happens when you cannot walk 100 miles in any useful direction? What happens when you know that the only viable alternative spot is already occupied by people who are just as hungry and just as desperate as you? Avoidance dies. Confrontation becomes mandatory. The most chilling evidence of this societal decay isn't always sharp trauma, though we do find indications of violence on scattered remains, but the silent evidence of profound systemic stress, the skeletons themselves. Studies of the remains from this era often reveal severe markers of dietary stress, arrested growth, and widespread dental hyperplasias, signs that, generation after generation, these communities teetered constantly on the brink of starvation, surviving on the meager caloric edge of the steppe environment. And when they encountered strangers, they weren't meeting them to trade information about new frontiers. They were meeting them to decide who got the next mammoth. The boundary between us and them hardened into a lethal line enforced by clubs, spears, and the cold, unyielding arithmetic of survival. They were trapped together, watching the snow fall, watching the herds thin, and facing the dreadful realization that their greatest competitor was no longer the saber-toothed tiger or the cold itself, but the gaze of the human standing opposite them. And this long pause, this crushing, immobile period of deep history, didn't just change how we fought, it changed how we thought. It changed our very notion of home and stranger. For 30,000 years, the defining struggle of humanity was not reaching for the stars or crossing oceans, but surviving the person next door in the confines of a prison made of ice and rock. But the prison, for all its strength, was never perfectly sealed. Pressure always finds a crack, and somewhere, during those long generations of struggle, while they were fighting over the last scraps of mammoth meat, humanity was quietly forging a tool, a weapon that would eventually allow us to shatter those walls and finally reclaim our birthright of endless wandering. That tool was not better spears or better clothes. It was the ability to manage the extreme cold, not just physically, but psychologically, using knowledge forged in generations of unrelenting Siberian misery. And when the ice finally began its slow, grinding retreat, they were ready to explode onto the world stage. But they wouldn't just walk out, they would conquer the final frontier, an entirely new continent, and they would do it with a ferocity born from 30,000 years of being absolutely, completely locked down. The thing we have to understand right now is the sheer, uncompromising map of the trap. We talk about the Ice Age like it was just a little chilly, maybe some extra snow. But you have to imagine the planet we inherited, a geologic vice grip designed by hostile titans. Look at the map of Eurasia 25,000 years ago. Forget the coastlines you recognize. They're underwater. But more importantly, look inward. To the north, running almost completely across the upper hemisphere, you have the great crushing ice sheets, mile-high walls of pure compact frozen water. Nothing crosses that. To the south, you have the vast, impassable high-altitude deserts of the Gobi and the brutal, soaring, oxygen-thin barrier of the Tibetan Plateau. It's an ecological dead zone. Our ancestors were squeezed relentlessly. We were left with this massive, impossibly cold, arid region stretching across what is today Siberia and Central Asia, the legendary, heartbreakingly beautiful, and terrifying Mammoth Steppe. This wasn't a forest. It was a tundra prairie that stretched to the horizon, defined by two things: endless wind and the enormous herds that sustained us. This place, the heart of Eurasia, was the invisible prison. It was the bottleneck where humanity almost died and where we stayed locked down for tens of thousands of years. Why? Because every single direction you walked led either to impassable mountains, barren seas, or the crushing, grinding edge of the ice. We were stuck in a thermodynamic box, and the only way to survive was to become harder, colder, and more efficient than the environment itself. You might think that after all this time, 50,000 years since we first left Africa, we would have figured out the basic mechanics of keeping warm. But the cold here was different. It wasn't just a threat, it was a fundamental law of existence. The moment you stopped thinking about the cold, you died. So, while we were struggling, fighting over every last scrap of frozen carcass, we were also in the midst of a silent, technological revolution. A revolution far more important than fire or the spear tip. We were perfecting the art of the perfect seal. Think about the sheer, unyielding intelligence it takes to survive negative 50 degrees Celsius for generations. A rough hide draped over the shoulders? That's for Africa. That's for a warm climate where insulation is nice but not necessary. Out here, if a gust of wind finds a single hole in your clothing, you lose the hand, the foot, the life. Our salvation was forged in bone and sinew. It was the invention of the eye needle, made of ivory or dense bone. That tiny, unremarkable tool is perhaps the greatest weapon humanity ever created, because the eye needle allowed us to move beyond simply wrapping ourselves in fur. It allowed us to tailor. It allowed us to stitch together layers of hide, not just one, but 2, 3, 4, creating sealed, insulated, thermally regulated survival systems. We developed the equivalent of Antarctic exploration gear, complete with sewn-in hoods, gloves, and completely sealed boots, thousands of years before agriculture. This is what gave us the edge. It wasn't just physical mastery, it was information management. Think of the societal infrastructure required to keep the knowledge of how to make, maintain, and pass on these complex garment systems. Every child had to be taught the exact right way to chew and soften hides, the specific sinew to use for maximum tension, the geometric necessity of the stitching pattern. This was knowledge, hammered out over millennia, written not on stone tablets, but in the fibers of their tailored clothes. And this mastery came with a psychological cost. The people who survived the Siberian bottleneck were, by necessity, ruthless pragmatists. They lived under absolute population pressure. If a band grew too large, or if the winter cull of the massive herds failed, someone had to go. Survival became a brutal calculus of thermodynamics and logistics. You had to calculate the weight of your possessions against the distance to the next potential kill. You had to calculate the calorie burn against the available fuel. We weren't spiritual wanderers anymore. We were calculating survival machines. We existed in a constant state of hypervigilance, prepared to exploit any weakness of the environment and perhaps more disturbingly, of each other. And then the earth shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, the climate began to warm. It wasn't an immediate thaw, it was a fitful, stuttering retreat of the great glaciers. But it created opportunity. The vast ice sheets began to melt back, drawing water away from the great continental shelves, exposing new, ancient landmasses, and, crucially, creating cracks in the northern wall of the prison. Suddenly, the relentless, suffocating pressure cooker of the Eurasian interior had an exit valve. The population that had been locked down, restrained, and forged into the ultimate surviving machine, a population that knew how to handle total environmental hostility, that possessed the tailored technology and the cold, calculated mindset necessary for sustained movement, was ready to move. But where do you go when you've mastered the coldest, cruelest environment on Earth? You don't head back to the cozy forests of Europe. You look toward the great unknown. You look east. For generations, their eyes must have strained toward the horizon across the frozen expanse of what is now the Bering Strait. This was the moment of destiny. This was the final frontier, an entirely new continent waiting to be claimed. And the people about to step onto that continent were not hopeful pioneers. They were the apex survivors of the ultimate human bottleneck. The question is, what happens when you unleash 30,000 years of bottled-up survival instincts onto a virgin world? What happens when a population bred for scarcity suddenly finds itself facing infinite abundance? They wouldn't just walk across that land bridge, they would explode. And the speed of their movement across this new world, the Americas, is one of the great, shocking mysteries of human history. Because almost overnight, they didn't just colonize a continent, they conquered it, moving from the Arctic Circle down to the tip of Patagonia in what seems, geologically speaking, like the blink of an eye. How did a small band of hyper-adapted hunter-gatherers manage a feat of migration that dwarfs every previous human movement? It wasn't luck. It was the weapon they forged in that invisible, icy prison. A combination of ruthless efficiency, unmatched technological tailoring, and an acquired psychological state that viewed the entire world as resources waiting to be exploited. They stepped off the edge of the known world, and within a few thousand years, they fundamentally rewrote the ecological map of two massive continents. And that conquest, that shocking speed of expansion, fundamentally tells us exactly how dark and how powerful the human spirit became while it was locked down, fighting for survival on the roof of the world. But getting there wasn't easy. The path out of the prison was complex, often terrifying, and dependent on a geography that was constantly changing. Because when they finally started walking east, they faced the greatest navigational puzzle in human history. Finding the exact right moment, the precise crack in the glacial armor that would allow them passage into the promised land. And there are two main theories about how they did it, each with its own terrifying implications about what they had to endure just to take the first step. We left our ancestors standing at the edge of Siberia, staring east, knowing that beyond the thin sliver of land they occupied lay a continent of ice, a barrier thicker and taller than any mountain range you have ever seen. Forget the maps you learned in school. This was not the Bering Strait we know today. This was Beringia, a massive, now sunken land bridge connecting the continents. They stood on the shores of that bridge, but beyond it, blocking any progress south into the main body of the Americas, was the ultimate geological jailer, the North American ice sheets. For thousands of years, the Laurentide ice sheet, stretching across eastern Canada, met the Cordilleran sheet draped along the Rockies. They fused into a single terrifying wall of white, miles high, effectively sealing off the lower continents. To go south, they had to defeat ice. And this is where the mystery of the speed, the sheer, shocking velocity of human conquest we talked about earlier, begins to make a terrible kind of sense. Because when they finally managed to slip past that prison gate, they didn't wander. They sprinted. They went from the Alaskan coast to the southern tip of Chile in maybe 1,000 to 2,000 years. That is a speed of dispersal unmatched in human history outside of modern transport. To achieve that, they must have known exactly where they were going, or they must have been absolutely driven by a terrible, necessary hunger. How did they get past the barrier? Academics generally propose two terrifying options, and both tell us everything about the kind of people they had become in their Central Asian crucible. The first, the classic theory, is the ice-free corridor. Imagine standing on a cold, gravel beach. To your left and right, the ocean is frozen, and above you, stretching into the atmosphere, are colossal walls of blue and white ice. But then, you see it, a seam, a narrow 1,500-kilometer-long gap between the two major ice sheets. This corridor theoretically opened up only when the two glaciers retracted slightly, perhaps 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. If this was their path, understand what they were walking into. This was not a garden. This was a meat grinder. The corridor would have been a desolate, windswept trench, scoured by glacial runoff, hemmed in by miles of solid ice. It would have been geographically available, but ecologically dead, for centuries after it opened. For the first humans to enter the corridor, there would have been little to no vegetation and even fewer large game animals. This was a desperation route, a one-way ticket where every single footstep demanded more energy than the landscape could possibly provide. You didn't migrate through the ice-free corridor. You survived a brutal geological gauntlet, relying purely on the stockpiled knowledge and sheer resilience you earned, fighting the steppe wolves and the crushing cold of the invisible prison. But there's a problem with this beautiful dramatic theory. The dates don't exactly line up with the archaeology. Sites like Monteverde in Chile, located incredibly far south, have been reliably dated back to 14,500 years ago, perhaps even earlier. If those dates hold, and they are widely accepted by now, it means humans were already deep in the Americas before the traditional opening date of that 1,500-kilometer inland trench. This leads us to the second, equally terrifying option, the coastal migration route, sometimes affectionately called the Kelp Highway. Look at the Pacific coastline of North America. Even during the peak glacial periods, the ice didn't always reach the sea. Sometimes there were pockets, refugia, thin strips of land, and islands, often covered in thick, nutritious kelp forests that might have remained biologically productive. This hypothesis suggests that our ancestors didn't wait for the corridor to open inland. They strapped themselves into hide boats, similar to the kayaks they may have already been developing in Asia, and simply hugged the coastline, island hopping, and following the immense productivity of the Pacific edge. This route sidesteps the ecological dead zone problem of the interior. The ocean is a reliable resource, providing seals, fish, and endless shellfish. But think about the psychological cost of this path. After being locked in land for millennia, after defining yourself by the ground under your feet, you now had to trust the most unpredictable element on Earth, the sea, to carry your entire future. You would be navigating a coast perpetually shrouded in mist, with massive ice sheets carving colossal, house-sized chunks of ice into the water right beside your tiny boat. Every morning you woke up, you had to choose between being crushed by the frozen landscape to your right or drowned by the dark, endless abyss to your left. This required a profound, terrifying shift in perspective. It meant viewing the world not just as prey and predator, but as a three-dimensional map where the risk of falling off the known world was constant. It showcases an audacity born of necessity, a people so determined to find better resources that they were willing to launch themselves into the unknown ocean, navigating without modern charts or tools, simply following the scent of kelp and the outline of land that often disappeared into the fog. Which route was it? The truth, as is often the case in deep history, might be both. Perhaps a small, seaworthy population used the kelp highway first, moving quickly south, establishing those deep sites like Monteverde. And perhaps the larger pedestrian groups followed much later through the ice-free corridor once it became traversable. But regardless of the specific geological crack they exploited, we must return to the engine driving them, the psychological state developed in the invisible prison. These were not wide-eyed explorers. They were survivors refined by thousands of years of systemic scarcity. They had developed a collective psychological state of constant expansion and resource exploitation. They had already become masters of the extreme environment, specialists in rapid adaptation, and unparalleled hunters. They stepped off the edge of the world and into a pristine ecosystem that had never encountered a human being. They arrived with the most sophisticated weapon ever devised, the organized, calculating human mind, and they wielded it against a world utterly unprepared for its impact. And the moment they stepped onto those two massive continents, armed with that terrible necessary hunger, the world fundamentally and catastrophically changed forever. Because as we trace their path south, we are not just tracing a timeline of human movement, we are tracing a massive, continent-spanning extinction event that still defines the Americas today. And that is what we must face next. What happens when the most successful predator in history meets the largest and most defenseless prey in history? You have to understand the sheer speed of this event. We talk about timelines in archaeological terms, thousands of years, and it sounds slow, like geologic change. But for the animals that lived in the Americas, this was instantaneous. This wasn't evolution. This was a slaughterhouse. Imagine a continent utterly untouched, teeming with creatures that had only ever faced lions, bears, and other specialized, localized predators. They saw us, these upright, noisy, two-legged things, and they didn't see the final chapter of their story. They saw a minor annoyance. We know what happened next because the geological record is brutally honest. Within a very brief window, maybe 1,000 years, perhaps even less in some specific regions, the massive American fauna vanished. The woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths that dwarfed a modern truck, the terrifying short-faced bears, the American camels and horses, gone, obliterated. The only things that survived were the animals too small, too fast, or too cautious to be efficiently targeted. Deer, bison, and the truly adaptable few. The academic consensus, the one we have to look squarely in the eye, points to one primary driver for this sudden, catastrophic ecological trauma: us. The overkill hypothesis might sound harsh, but the correlation is undeniable. We, the people whose ancestors struggled to make it past the Altai Mountains for 50 millennia, finally broke the seal, and the moment we arrived in a new land, we demonstrated the full, terrible extent of our specialized expertise. We hunted them to oblivion. This wasn't malice, it was mathematics. Our ancestors weren't cartoon villains, they were simply the ultimate expression of the survival specialist. They came in waves, armed with sophisticated Clovis points, the ultimate, terrifyingly effective spearheads, and they found the largest, slowest, most calorie-dense targets imaginable, and the human population exploded in direct proportion to the sudden, unprecedented availability of protein. But here is the central paradox, the one that ties the conquering of the Americas back to the invisible prison in Central Asia. The success was too great. Think about it. You find paradise, you exploit it perfectly, and then, what happens when the resource pool is suddenly empty? When you have built a massive civilization, or at least a thriving network of hunting bands, based on the assumption that massive protein will always be walking around, the moment the last mastodon fell, the psychological clock started ticking. The population that had exploded now had nowhere to go. They couldn't move north. Beringia was gone, flooded by the rising seas. They couldn't move south. They were already at the tip of Patagonia. They were trapped on two continents they had just depopulated. The great expansion ground to a halt. What followed in the Americas was a painful, forced transition. The Clovis culture, the masters of the hunt, the specialists who conquered the world had to die out, or rather, they had to be fundamentally repurposed. They had to transition into the myriad, diverse, grindingly difficult cultures we call the Archaic period. They stopped being specialized mega-hunters and started becoming incredibly resourceful generalists, fishing, gathering seeds, hunting smaller game, and managing landscapes. They learned, out of necessity, to walk away from the glory of the great kill and accept the sustained mediocrity of persistent, subtle resource management. And here, we loop back to the central mystery. We know, absolutely, that the moment humanity was given an open, unprepared landscape, we could conquer it in a geological blink. We saw that in Australia, we saw that in Europe, and we certainly saw that in the Americas. We are the ultimate expansionist species. So why the hell did they stop for 50,000 years in the brutal, marginal steppes of Central Asia? Why did the invisible prison hold us captive for so long? It wasn't a physical barrier that held them back. The physical barrier was eventually broken. It wasn't technological inability, because the tools they carried into the Americas were refinements of those developed in Asia. The prison, we realize, must have been a function of a terrible equilibrium. In the steppes of Asia, life was hard, cold, and marginal, but it was stable. The mammoths and bison were already wary of us. The populations were kept naturally low by the environment. Every advance, every new technique, every slight increase in birth rate was immediately crushed by a harsh winter, a changing climate, or the simple exhaustion of localized resources. It was a perfect, crushing Malthusian trap. The system was just resilient enough to keep us alive, but absolutely unforgiving enough to prevent any sustained, successful expansion. Every time they tried to burst out, they retreated, losing numbers, losing morale, losing years of cultural progress. And that is what Central Asia gifted us. A generationally enforced psychological state of stasis. They learned, unconsciously, that expansion was inherently high risk, that success led to inevitable collapse, and that the only guaranteed path to survival was relentless, miserable, cautious persistence in a known, terrible environment. When the climate shifted and that psychological prison was breached, they exploded outwards, but they took that trauma with them. They carried the ghost of Asian stasis into the New World, and when they faced the inevitable resource collapse in the Americas, they reacted. But they were still haunted by the lesson learned in the ice, that the boom always leads to the bust. How do you break the cycle? How do you maintain a large, successful population that has just destroyed its primary food source and is now too numerous to go back to simple hunter-gathering? There is only one solution known to human history that can solve the problem of overwhelming success, leading to existential population failure. It is the solution that required them to stop following the herds and start managing the land itself. It is the ultimate technological breakthrough, the final undoing of the hunter-gatherer mind. But that required a level of deep psychological commitment that was almost antithetical to everything they had learned on the frozen steppes. It required permanence. It required deep investment in the land. It required settling down. And the question we must ask ourselves now, as we move into the final chapters of this strange journey, is whether they ever truly managed to escape the ghost of the prison, even when they put down roots. Because as we trace the origins of agriculture, we are not tracing a story of sudden genius, but a desperate scramble for survival, born out of the ecological debt accrued by our own catastrophic yet necessary success. They had always been defined by movement. Freedom was not an abstract political concept to them, it was the measure of their survival. If the great elk shifted their migration path, you followed. If the berries failed, you walked until you found new ones. The idea of existential commitment to a single arbitrary patch of dirt was not only alien, it was profoundly dangerous. And yet, here we stand at the precipice of the greatest cultural betrayal in human history. The ecological debt, the immense number of dead megafauna, and the corresponding population boom that followed, had cornered us. There was no longer enough wild landscape to support the nomadic lifestyle required to feed 7 billion years of successful breeding. The system was failing. We had to stop walking. But settling down, truly settling down, was not a sudden burst of agrarian genius. It was a slow, agonizing process of psychological confinement. If you want to see the first great test case for the invisible prison taking visible form, you have to look into the Levant, the fertile arch cradling the Mediterranean, roughly 15,000 years ago. This is where we find the people known academically as the Natufians. They are the great anomaly. Before the invention of true farming, these people began building things, permanent stone houses, storage pits, even cemeteries. Think about that for a second. For millennia, if a loved one died, they were buried or left, and you moved on. The idea of creating a fixed, sacred place for your dead meant that you were committing future generations to remain exactly where they were. You were anchoring the ghost of your past to the physical landscape. Why did they stop? Because the environment here, specifically, was extraordinarily forgiving, but also volatile. Wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew in such dense, staggering abundance that the harvest yielded enough calories to sustain a sizable group for months without having to leave. They were not yet farmers. They were sedentary hunter-gatherers, masters of localized, intensive harvesting. It sounds like a perfect middle ground, doesn't it? Maximum calorie input with minimum risk. But we know, you and I, that nothing in this story is ever free. The moment they settled, they changed the definition of wealth. When you are nomadic, your wealth is what you can carry, what you can immediately consume, and the knowledge in your head. It is portable and relatively safe. When you settle, your wealth becomes the immense pile of grain stored in pits dug beneath the floor of your permanent house. This stored surplus is the physical manifestation of the invisible prison. That grain is life. It keeps you alive through the lean season, allows you to have more children, and frees up time from constant foraging. But it also creates the first terrifying human vulnerability, a massive, immobile target. Suddenly, the threat isn't the migrating herd or the climate. The threat is the person in the next village, or even the person in the next hut who hasn't managed their resources as effectively as you have. For the first time, we needed walls, not just against the winter wind, but against each other. Defense became a permanent, essential feature of daily life. And perhaps more terrifyingly, dependency became total. Imagine the HG mind, built on diversity. If they knew 50 plants and 10 animals, and one failed, they ate the other 59. Your settled ancestor, betting everything on the continued success of the wild barley field just outside the village gate, has entered a covenant of high-risk anxiety. Their entire lineage now hinges on a successful rainy season, a manageable pest population, and the willingness of the environment to cooperate. One flash flood, one unexpected dry spell, one blight, and everything collapses. The deep psychological burden of this commitment is what drove the final, desperate step toward true agriculture. The Natufians and those who followed them throughout the Near East were not looking for a better way to live. They were desperately trying to stabilize the high-stakes game they had accidentally entered. They had no choice but to intervene. And how did we intervene? By selecting the failures. The success of the settled lifestyle meant that humans began preferentially harvesting the grain heads that did not shatter naturally when ripe, the ones that held their seeds tightly to the stem. In the wild, a grain that holds its seeds is a failed grain. It cannot propagate. But for us, it was the perfect prize, easy to collect, easy to process. We didn't realize it at the time, but every single harvest was an act of intense, forced evolution. Over hundreds of generations, we inadvertently selected for the genetic flaw that made the grain entirely dependent on us for reproduction. We created crops that, if left alone, would simply drop to the ground and fail to reseed successfully. We didn't domesticate the crops. We entered a mutual domestication contract. We became slaves to the growing cycle, chained to the physical requirements of weeding, watering, and protecting the fragile plants we had engineered. The crops ensured our stability, but only at the cost of our movement. And by anchoring ourselves permanently to these self-made dependencies, these small, visible prisons of stone and mud, we triggered the next inevitable boom. The caloric output of these proto-agricultural systems meant the population density skyrocketed far beyond anything the old nomadic system could ever support. The return button had been surgically removed. There was no going back to the freedom of the steppe. The hunter-gatherer was now economically obsolete. We had solved the problem of the invisible prison of Central Eurasia, the crushing ecological debt accrued by our own success, by trading it for a new, smaller prison, the village. And as the population continued to surge, pushing the boundaries of what the land could sustain, the tension we had tried to escape didn't vanish. It just became more localized, more intense, and infinitely more dangerous. We were permanent now. We were anchored. And the next existential problem we faced wasn't how to survive, but how to live with ourselves once we realized we could never leave. We settled. We built homes, real homes, structures that mocked the flimsy yurts of our grandparents. And immediately, we faced the harsh mathematics of fixed space. You see, the great advantage of the nomad, their absolute ecological genius, was dilution. They never stayed long enough to poison their own well. They never accrued enough waste to create a permanent disease reservoir. They never gave their parasites a permanent address. Now we were creating a perfect, self-contained petri dish of humanity. Look at the skeletons unearthed from these early permanent settlements in the Fertile Crescent, or the similar proto-agricultural sites springing up across Central Eurasia. The first thing that hits you, the immediate payment for caloric security, is the physical decline. The people who lived and died anchored to that small patch of land were frankly less healthy than the wanderers who came before them. Forget the romantic image of the strong farmer. We traded bone density for bread. Their teeth, your teeth if you trace your lineage back far enough, rotted. The shift from a high-protein, varied hunter-gatherer diet to a carbohydrate-heavy staple crop, wheat, barley, rice, was a dental catastrophe. We were domesticating grains, but those grains were destroying our jaws. You see evidence of anemia, vitamin deficiencies, and skeletal stress caused by repetitive, back-breaking agricultural labor. That aching back you get sometimes? That's not a modern complaint. That is the biological echo of the first farmer chained to his field, but the real, insidious terror of the village was proximity. We brought our flocks, the sheep, the goats, the pigs, right into our living rooms, or at least right into our immediate proximity. And every single domestic animal carried a biological tax that we had never paid before: zoonotic disease. We began sharing parasites, breathing in aerosolized feces, and creating reservoirs for pathogens that thrive on high population density. Measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, the great killers that would shape human history for millennia. These were not natural features of the wild. They were products of our own success, the biological offspring of the invisible prison we had built. We were breeding human beings faster than the land could naturally sustain, and the microbes were adjusting their strategy accordingly. We were trapped by our anchor, and now we were trapped by our own rotting biomass. And if disease wasn't enough, the fundamental economic structure of the village forced a reckoning that our nomadic ancestors would have found monstrous: the end of equality. When you wander, you carry only what you need. Surplus is a burden, a thing that weighs you down. Social hierarchy is minimal. The skill of the hunter is immediately validated by the kill, and the skill of the gatherer by the day's haul. But when you settle, you accumulate. You build granaries. You create a surplus designed to carry you through the next drought or the next winter. And that surplus, that huge visible mound of caloric energy, immediately requires two things: defense and management. This is where the invisible prison begins to acquire its first visible bars. Who guards the grain? Who decides when the grain is distributed? Who gets the better land closest to the water? Suddenly, the village that promised security becomes a cauldron of localized tension. We invented poverty simultaneously with surplus. Those who had managed to secure slightly better fields, or those who were deemed responsible for managing the collective store, began to solidify power. This wasn't necessarily malice. It was structural necessity. The entire village economy depended on centralized control of the stored energy. But the minute we centralized the grain, we created the chief, or the priest, or the big man. This is the birth of hierarchy as a permanent feature of human society. We exchanged the existential fairness of the empty steppe for the structural unfairness of the crowded village. And because we were anchored, because the return button had been surgically removed, and the population density meant that walking away meant certain starvation, disagreement could no longer be solved by simply splitting up and traveling in different directions. The only exit strategy was conflict. The very first walls we built were not romantic symbols of community. They were fortifications necessitated by the realization that our neighbors, facing the exact same local scarcity and population pressure, were eyeing our stored wealth. The archaeological record shows a brutal increase in evidence of inter-settlement conflict, mass graves, skeletal remains showing signs of systemic, organized violence, and rapidly constructed defensive palisades. We weren't just fighting for territory anymore. We were fighting for accumulated stuff. We were fighting for the survival of the physical anchor itself. The paradox of the Central Eurasian invisible prison was complete. Our successful adaptation to an ecological crisis created a social and biological crisis that was even more localized, intense, and destructive. We were trapped in tight communities, sickened by our own filth, governed by necessary hierarchies, and constantly fighting our neighbors over fixed resources. The village, the solution, had become an inescapable, high-pressure confinement cell. And as the years turned into centuries, as the population continued to balloon and the pressure on the localized environment became truly unsustainable, our ancestors faced a terrifying conclusion. The anchor, the very thing that saved them from starvation, was beginning to drown them in conflict. They had to find a way to relieve the pressure. They had to find a way to stop fighting their cousins just down the river. The only method left to a people trapped and armed, yet overflowing with life, was to expand the boundaries of the prison itself. The next step wouldn't be about settling down. It would be about projecting that crushing internal pressure outward, forcing the anchor to drag across the landscape. The inevitable consequence of being stuck in the middle of the world was about to break the dam. And what came next wasn't agriculture. It was civilization. And it demanded an entirely new kind of violence, a violence designed not just to defend the home, but to build an empire out of fear. The pressure was too much. You couldn't just tell 50,000 people who were barely scraping by in a tight, fertile valley to get along. You couldn't ask 10,000 armed men, descendants of generations who had learned to defend their piece of ground with cold efficiency, to simply disarm and share. That ship had sailed the moment the numbers became unsustainable. The only way to keep the peace internally was to impose a structure so rigid, so terrifyingly organized, that the fight was sucked out of the people and projected entirely onto the outside. This is where we break the historical myth, because what came next wasn't the beautiful, spontaneous blossoming of culture. It was the birth of the administrative state, designed purely to manage the violence of the trap. Think about it. The first great cities, places like Uruk in ancient Sumer, weren't founded because someone woke up and said, "Let's invent architecture." They were founded because someone needed a centralized mechanism to distribute grain, control irrigation, raise massive armies, and, most crucially, write down who owed what to whom. This, my friends, is the darkest secret of the anchor. Civilization wasn't an achievement. It was a necessary bureaucratic invention to manage an unsolvable population crisis born in the middle of the world. To run a state that is constantly expanding to relieve internal pressure, you need walls, both of mud brick and of ideology. You need specialized roles. You need soldiers whose primary loyalty is not to their tribe, but to the system that pays them in grain and fear. You need scribes, the true early engineers of the prison, using cuneiform not to record poetry, but to log how much wheat was pulled from the field, how many workers were conscripted, and how many oxen were lost in the raid against the people just over the hill. We often look at the invention of writing as a monumental intellectual leap, and it was. But it was fundamentally a tool of accounting, a cold, dispassionate method of tracking resources so that the central engine of the state could keep running. It was the invention of the ultimate spreadsheet, designed to ensure that the inevitable conflict was controlled, regulated, and directed away from the central power. This means that the Great Escape, the move from the invisible Central Asian prison to the Fertile Crescent, wasn't really an escape at all. It was just the construction of a new, much larger prison, built out of mud, bureaucracy, and the memory of scarcity. What happens when you project that crushing internal pressure outward? You create empires. Empires are, historically, the inevitable consequence of high-density populations trapped by stable, resource-rich locations who, having run out of internal space, must consume external space to survive. They carry the disease of the anchor with them. They require constant, brutal expansion because the population management system, the very mechanism that keeps the peace internally, demands perpetual resource acquisition. The moment the expansion stops, the pressure turns inward and the empire collapses, often dissolving into the chaotic, localized fighting it was invented to prevent. We are watching the echo of this pattern play out for millennia. Every great empire, from Akkad to Rome, from the Han Dynasty to the British Empire, has struggled with the exact same flaw. The mechanism designed to relieve the pressure of being localized eventually becomes too complex, too consuming, and too distant from the primary resources it needs to sustain itself. They were all just grand, temporary mechanisms to manage the terrifying truth that we humans, when we stopped walking and committed to a fixed spot, generated unsustainable growth. So where does that leave us? Our journey, tracing the human line back from the invention of the nuclear bomb all the way back to the simple decision to stay put by a fertile oasis, reveals a horrifying continuity. We never escaped the anchor. Yes, the physical environment of Central Asia is no longer dictating our movements. We have planes, trains, and the internet. We can physically move vast distances, but we remain psychologically trapped by the necessities forced upon us in that pivotal moment 10,000 years ago. Look at our political systems today. They are all, in their essence, refined versions of those original state mechanisms. Complex bureaucracies designed to manage population, allocate resources, and, crucially, determine who gets to stay inside the wall and who belongs outside. We still fight over borders, we still fight over resources, and we still build massive centralized systems that promise stability in exchange for control. We carry the ghost of the anchor in our DNA, not genetically, but culturally. We are obsessed with ownership, with permanence, and with centralized authority because those were the tools that saved our ancestors from starving when they were lashed to the spot. The tragedy of human history is that the same behavioral adaptations that saved us from extinction, the ability to organize, build systems, and defend territory ruthlessly, are the same ones that lock us into cycles of conflict today. We became so good at defending the walls of the prison that we forgot how to dismantle them. Our ancestors were forced to choose between starvation and being anchored, and they chose the anchor. They paid for that stability with their freedom, their mobility, and their innocence. They traded the vast, unknowable freedom of the open plains for the controlled, predictable violence of the state. And you and I? We are the inheritors of that awful compromise. We live in the world they built. We live in the largest, most successful iteration of the invisible prison ever conceived. It wasn't alien influence that stuck us here. It wasn't some grand conspiracy. It was the simple, beautiful, terrifying force of human life itself, overflowing and refusing to die, forcing us to build ever larger, ever more complex cages just to manage the chaos of our own desperate survival. We stopped walking, and in that pause, we built the world, and we have been stuck in the center of it ever since.